our third and final panel, our true cleanup panel. This panel has more discussants and fewer presenters. And again, I want this to be sort of as interactive and iterative with the audience as possible. So everybody knows by now the rules in the running order. Let me just remind you all, anybody who wants to, the videographers would prefer it if you stand at the podium, but I will not impose that on you. You should feel free to sit or stand. Sorry. Jonathan, you can take it away.
Cool.
Uh-oh.
How do I get things to advance? And
Carol, that's the wrong one.
here we go. This one will work. Cool. So I'm Jonathan Chaplin from New Street Research. My firm covers the telecommunications and cable industries globally. I have to say that this is a little bit embarrassing. When Stuart asked me to be on this panel, I knew I had absolutely nothing insightful or interesting to say about the auction at all. And I called 3 people to give me intelligent things that I could say and pretend were my words. And all three of them were on the panel. None of them told me that they were going to be on the panel today. So all my comments are attributable to 3 people that are on the panel. I'm not going to tell you which 3. I'm also at a bit of a loss in that when Stuart told me there was a time limit, I thought it was going to be more of a screen than a cap, so I've got too many slides. I'm going to flip through them pretty quickly. So first off, I think you've heard this from everybody this morning so far. The auction worked from our perspective. You got 70 megahertz of spectrum to its highest and best use through a new mechanism that allowed buyers and sellers to transact. It was unique. It was tried. It worked. We've heard a lot about the very complex modeling that went on behind the scenes to produce this auction. We tend to look at things much more simplistically on Wall Street. When we looked at the prospect of the incentive auction, initially we gave it 0 chance of success. We predicted that 0 megahertz would be transferred. After the Greenhill reports, when it became clear that the broadcasters were in fact going to participate, we thought 40 to 60 megahertz would be success. And in fact, 70 megahertz was transferred to the wireless industry. And so from our perspective, from Wall Street's perspective, that was well beyond what anyone expected, certainly early in the process. There's been one complaint that you've heard today, which is that the proceeds to the broadcasters were lower than they may have expected when they decided to get involved. And this potentially poses a problem not just for the broadcasters. If you look at the sort of the gap between initial expectations that may have been around $45 billion and proceeds of $10 billion, listening to Eddie's comments, there may be issues with broadcasters or others looking at this example and being willing to participate in auctions like this in the future, and that would be a pity. So we know why the price was low. It was because Verizon and AT&T didn't show up. The fact that they didn't show up shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody. We knew before the auction started that whatever demand they'd expressed back in 2011 was greatly diminished by the time the auction started. The question I keep getting, and I think it's come up a lot in the panel so far, is why? If John Leibowitz identified a spectrum crisis back in 2010, that we couldn't possibly produce enough spectrum to meet the demands of that crisis, why didn't AT&T and Verizon bid? And there are a few reasons, and I think the first one is a function of timing. So we had 2 auctions within 2 years that produced a massive amount of spectrum in a concentrated period of time. So the amount of spectrum that the carriers had increased by almost 40% in the space of 2 years. And the amount of investment in spectrum by the carriers increased 111%. So that's a lot of spectrum coming to market in a concentrated period of time. There was also alternatives. What I think of is shadow supply. So 70 megahertz was auctioned. There's 120 megahertz of other spectrum sitting on the sidelines. And for some of the participants in the auction, this is actually better spectrum for their more immediate needs than the spectrum being auctioned. So that must have had, it's unclear how we measured the impact that this had on prices paid in the auction, but it must have had some impact. And in the case of FirstNet, we're almost certain it had a very significant impact. The other issue is the kind of spectrum that's being auctioned here. So the setters of prices in the auction are by and large going to be AT&T and Verizon. They've got 75% of the industry's subscribers, 95% of the industry's cash flow. For an auction to be successful, for high prices to be set, it's almost a necessity that they play a significant role. They've got a lot of this kind of spectrum already. The other issue is that, while they're the price setters, in aggregate, the industry is resource constrained, and part of this is a function of the auction that's just happened. But when you take out the dividend commitments that AT&T and Verizon have, the industry collectively has $11 billion of free cash flow to commit to asset acquisition. This is an industry that isn't growing free cash flow anymore. It might be growing at T-Mobile, but at the same time, it's declining at AT&T and Verizon. So the proceeds in this auction, or at least what the carriers spend in this auction, is 2 times, 2 years worth of annual free cash flow for the industry, and that's a lot. You've also got to take into consideration the fact that from a debt perspective, the industry's tapped out. AT&T and Verizon have a leverage threshold of around 2.5 times. They're at that threshold more or less today. Sprint's undeniably over-levered. T-Mobile's at its leverage threshold as well. There just isn't a lot of resources to commit to assets like this, and there are a lot of demands on the resources they do have. So spectrum isn't the only thing the carriers are in the process of trying to acquire at the moment. The whole focus right now is on unlocking the value of a new band of spectrum for the carriers, millimeter wave. In order to do that, it's going to take an incredible amount of investment in fiber, in fixed infrastructure. And all of that is competing with the resources that they've got available for this spectrum at this moment in time. One of the sort of driving lessons for me is that the policy process and the technology process are happening on just massively different timeframes. When this auction was conceived back in 2010, we lived in a 3G world. The dominant device of the time was the iPhone 3GS. Facebook wasn't even a public company. It was 2 years away from becoming a public company. Evan Spiegel was in high school. The Tesla S hadn't been released yet. When the auction actually happened, we were in a post-4G world. So the carriers had all finished their LTE deployments, and we're already looking ahead to 5G. And when the spectrum actually becomes useful, deployable, by and large, we're going to be firmly within a 5G world. So the amount of change in terms of the businesses that are using the spectrum and the underlying technology that drives the utility of the spectrum has been tremendous over the period during which this auction was sort of conceived, happened, and the spectrum becomes available. This really sort of draws on that same point. Back when the auction was conceived, low-band spectrum was worth double what mid-band spectrum was. That all changed in about 2013 when Verizon deployed LTE on 700 megahertz. So that was the first time we deployed a data network on low-band spectrum. And after that, we saw a reversal in terms of spectrum values with, by the time AWS-3 rolled around, mid-band spectrum being worth twice what low-band spectrum was being valued at. So the question I have, and after listening to the complexity of the processes and analysis that went to go into setting this auction up, is so as an outsider, I wouldn't dare to offer suggestions on how we fix this. But what I would do is ask, what can we do to bring the principles of agile development to the process of developing policy around these sorts of issues? So in the world of software development, business development, new company formation, the approach the world is moving to is try something. If it works, then build upon it. If it doesn't work, fail fast, so the costs of failure are low, and adapt and change. I'm not exactly sure, given the complexity that was involved in setting something like this up, how you bring those principles to an auction process. But I think until you do, you're going to be left with this disconnect between creating a perfect solution for something, but that by the time you deliver that solution, the world's changed completely, and it doesn't serve the purpose that it was originally envisaged for. Delaying, one of the issues that we raised was the timing of the auction. Delaying the auction wouldn't necessarily have been a good idea. We're looking at accelerating traffic growth on networks at the moment. After the launch of Unlimited, that 48% I think probably goes to 60 or 70% in 2Q. The timing actually may have had completely fortuitously, a pro-competitive outcome. So it allowed T-Mobile to acquire 30 megahertz of spectrum, which if everybody had participated to the extent that they suggested in 2011, almost certainly wouldn't have happened. You now have a challenger, a very active challenger with as much spectrum as Verizon. When you think about the impact that has on prices and innovation in the industry, it's probably a good thing. And given that I've been flashed the 1-minute card, I'm going to skip these next 3 slides and get to one that has absolutely nothing to do with the auction whatsoever. But since I've got the mic and I'm in a room with a bunch of economists and policy people, I'm going to make a shameless plug for my own research by making 2 points. Based on how we look at the industry, we think it's incredibly unlikely that 4 carriers could simultaneously earn their cost of capital in the wireless business. The fixed costs and the investment required are just too high, given the revenue and profits available to the industry. So a 4-carrier market is fundamentally unsustainable in our view, and it's going to become more unsustainable as we move into a 5G world with the investment that's going to be required to deliver 5G. And as a backup point, I'd say that it may, a 4-carrier market may not even be necessary. Based on our analysis of wireless markets globally, it seems to us that the number of carriers isn't the most significant driver at all of where pricing and competitive intensity in a market is. It's the distribution of share across carriers, which is by far the most significant factor. And with that, I'll hand it over to Paul.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, Paul. You can stand or sit.
I'll sit. So I'm Paul Dessart. I had the privilege of being at the FCC at the beginning of the auction, at the end of the auction, and in between I was one of Jonathan's colleagues. I was a Wall Street analyst at Bernstein Research. So I wasn't representing anyone, didn't have a dog in the fight for the auction. I also made the mistake, I think, of following Stuart's instructions and actually framing my comments around 4 questions that he mentioned at the beginning. So let me start with the first question, which was, what are the main lessons for the future from the incentive auction? I think the biggest lesson, I'd like to echo what Eddie said. I think really the biggest lesson is that government can do hard things when it puts its mind to it. I think particularly at this point in time when you can't really move without tripping over some libertarian rant or some panel about abolishing the FCC. It's really important to recognize that the FCC and the other government branches of government who worked on getting this auction done really achieved something important and large. And it was a case where it wasn't sort of, well, should the government do it or should the market do it? It was a case where the government made the market and the market produced, I think, what was a pretty efficient outcome if you listen to the earlier speakers. I think the second lesson is maybe more of a process lesson, which is, I think it is helpful for the FCC and our agencies generally to have a budget for independent external expertise, right? I mean, I think, notwithstanding the FCC's incredible capabilities, I think everyone there would probably agree that without the budget and the ability to bring in the external software people and the external economists, this thing wouldn't have got done. And one of the things that was a learning for me going into government from being in business was it's actually really hard to do that, right? So I think probably the unsung heroes, or one of them here, are the people who did the procurement, right? I mean, doing procurement is really, really hard and painful and time-consuming. And Evan and other people who actually, just it doesn't involve a lot of algebra. It doesn't involve a lot of like PhD level stuff. It's just really hard grind, but it's critical. I don't think this auction would have, Gary can correct me, but I don't think it would have got done without people paying attention to that. And I would say, look, this may be a model for other big policy issues. I think, certainly with respect to merger reviews, one of the things that was started with Comcast NBC was this idea that Gary mentioned of forming a team that's cross bureaus, right? Having dedicated people, bringing people in from the outside to have expertise, and really, as one would do in business, right, having a team that focuses on a single difficult problem and tries to get the best possible answer. And I think that also raises the level of discourse from other stakeholders, right? I mean, if the agency knows what it's talking about, then the people who are affected by this are also forced, if they don't want to be disadvantaged, to raise their game and also bring a high level of discourse and interaction. So the second lesson I would say is maybe a broader lesson, which is, in big policy issues, how can we make sure that, there is that sort of budget and time taken for independent external expertise, and particularly as I think the industry consolidates and often it's not really a fair fight in terms of stakeholders, so that if the commission can't commission its own work, the asymmetry of information coming into the building is really huge. And so it's very difficult for the policymakers to sit there and just sort of be judges, because you don't have this huge attacker industry with a bunch of economists and a huge incumbent industry with a bunch of economists sort of fighting it out on equal terms. It's such a huge asymmetry now with the industry consolidation that I think it becomes even more important. The last just quick point I'll say in terms of lessons learned is it is clearly true, as the earlier panelists have said, that the Commission has now created this new tool, right, in the same way that the original auctions created this new tool that was used several times subsequently. They have created this new tool of I'll call it the incentive auction just to bug Greg, but it is this new tool of the incentive auction, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see. And it'll relate to the last question of, is this going to be more like putting a man on the moon, right? Which was this incredibly complicated thing, incredibly impressive, but it was kind of a one-time thing. Or are we going to actually be able to find ways to use this, particularly now that we're kind of down the learning curve a little bit, and also we've probably used this tool on the hardest problem, right? If we go and use it on other areas, it's maybe both less complex and quicker to execute. Second question that Stuart asked was, on what, if anything, have you changed your mind in light of the course of the auction? And I thought I would start with two caveats. The first is, I don't think it's possible to be surprised about the value of the spectrum, because it feels like we go through this sort of Groundhog Day every time there's an auction, right? Where people come up with some random metric, $1 per megahertz pop or something. They come up with all these random predictions. The auction happens, the predictions are totally wrong. Everyone's like, oh, we're so surprised. Then a couple of years go by and we do exactly the same thing again, right? So everyone was so surprised about the AWS3 auction being so high. And then we had exactly the same predictive mechanism. And then we were all really surprised that the 600 auction was so low. So I think it's my suspicion, I think, and again, Gary and the team should say, but I think, look, the guys sitting in the commission who had perfect information, I think were probably much less surprised by much of the stuff that was going on. But from the outside, I think, I used to be a physicist at one point, and I think, at some point you recognize there's some things that are just unknowable. And my suspicion is how much money is going to be raised by a given auction at a given point of time. It's just kind of unknowable from the outside. And so we should stop making predictions. Sorry. That's not good career advice for an analyst, which is why I'm no longer an analyst. The second kind of caveat I'll say is, it's not clear that the outcome of the auction was right. And I don't mean that from did the mechanism work and was it efficient? I mean it more from the business strategy sense, right? So if we go back and think about earlier auctions, I think in retrospect, one might say some of the carrier strategies in some auctions with a 5-year sort of hindsight was just wrong, right? I mean, was it right for Sprint and T-Mobile to sit out so many auctions earlier on, right? Was it right for, other carriers to kind of miss what Verizon got, which was a 700 C block? Actually, that was perfectly good usable spectrum, notwithstanding the openness conditions, right? So I think, in a way, it's great that we're having this conference now, but it will actually be kind of interesting to have it in 5 years from now and say, well, were the business decisions and the budget decisions that the carriers made actually, in retrospect, right? I mean, I got to say, for me, I think it's somewhat hard to believe that everyone can be right. So it's hard to believe that, private equity firms and maybe Dish, who have bought this spectrum perhaps more as a financial investment, can be right, and AT&T and Verizon saying we're sitting it out. Like, if these guys are going to be the buyers of these guys' spectrum in the future, that's their thesis is we're going to sell it to AT&T and Verizon. AT&T and Verizon's thesis is we don't need it. It's hard to see how both of these parties can be correct, right? It's I got to say, for me, it's a little hard to say that low band is just, it's hard to see how it went from being beachfront to garbage in like 7 years. Like, it just doesn't make, I don't see that technology's evolved so quickly. I think spectrum is fungible enough. I think, even though there are other tools for increasing capacity, whether it's densification or refarming or better spectral efficiency or changing pricing, it does seem clear that having clean spectrum, even if it's to roll out, so let's say 5G is going to start getting rolled out in 1920, the idea that you just have a clean block of spectrum in order to do that, and you don't have to refarm spectrum that's already being used for 3G or 4G, which I think is T-Mobile's partly stated strategy, right? We've got this new clean 600. That's going to make it easier for us to roll out 5G. I mean, that to me makes a lot of sense, and it's hard for me to see how this spectrum, as I said, can have so little value, notwithstanding even the frequency characteristics, but just as clean spectrum that might be able to accelerate your 5G rollout. The last one I'll say is also, even on the cable, I know there's some cable consultants on earlier panels, I've got to say it's not obvious to me that cable strategy, right, of Comcast only bidding and only buying spectrum in region is going to turn out to the right one. I mean, it seems almost that cable would have been better off, particularly given the Charter Comcast kind of announcement last week, which I think makes a great deal of business sense. It seems like it would make sense to have nationwide spectrum. It might make sense to have no spectrum. How it makes sense to have spectrum kind of just in Comcast footprint, not totally obvious, right? Again, it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. The third question that Stu mentioned was which of the auction rules played out differently from what you were expecting, and what does that tell us? And again, I think being on the outside and not having lived with these rules for 5 years and having tried with very limited ability to read all the NPRMs, which had, I think, more algebra and calculus in them than the entire history of the FCC up to that point. It's I think hard to say what should be changed, because it is obviously a big, delicate, interconnected machine, and so one can say, oh well, maybe this little piece didn't work, but I think and you guys correct me, but I think the danger is that if you change that little piece, you're going to have some huge tidal wave over here of unintended consequences. And so in a way, it was a nicely constructed machine. I think some of the things that people mentioned on earlier panels maybe didn't work out quite, at least as I expected reading the NPRM, right? So the impairment, all the impaired blocks and all the extra stuff that was going on around impairment, I think was solved quicker than at least I expected, given the border agreements. I wasn't so sure the Mexico and Canadian stuff would get fixed as quickly as it did. The public broadcast, I think fewer broadcasters are going to end up going off the air than maybe I thought, given between spectrum sharing and given just sort of the dynamics of the auction. Repacking, I think we'll sort of see how that turns out. Gene's here somewhere, right? So too early to. That's for our 5 year from now conference again. Let's see how repacking turned out.
Yeah, 39 months. That's the 5 year conference. The reserve. I think hard to tell. I think for me, I would say, I think there is a possibility that the reserve prevented a strategy of foreclosure by the incumbents. And as Jonathan said, when you have two incumbents with essentially the entire industry's cash flow, it doesn't seem unreasonable to have some kind of set aside. It also doesn't seem unreasonable, I've got to say, even though, again, it's probably economic heresy, to say that competition policy, you can use auctions to some extent for competition policy. I think particularly when almost every other tool that other countries use for competition policy is sort of not really allowed to be talked about in the US, right? You can't really talk about unbundling anymore. You can't really talk about price regulation anymore. If you want to have ex-ante competition policy of any kind, which I think does make sense given the industry structure, if you've got a vehicle like auction rules and a reserve to do it, I don't think necessarily, even at the cost of some economic purity, just from a social benefit public interest perspective, it may make sense to do it. Then in my last 40 seconds, the last question was, where might we use an incentive auction next, and what changes would you recommend? So I mean, it seems to me that I think, at least with respect to spectrum, a lot is going to depend on how effective other tools are, right? So how effective is sharing going to be, right? How effective is just ordering people, federal users or whatever, off their spectrum, right? How effective is what I guess used to be done, which is just sort of giving people a fixed amount of money to go away rather than having a market-based system on both sides. So to some extent, we have all these tools that are now substitutes for repurposing spectrum. That being said, it does seem that if you tick through the spectrum bands, things like the satellite spectrum may be an ideal place to try and use this sort of moon landing tool again, because it does seem like a case where there's spectrum that could be repurposed, and there's sort of market-based buyers and sellers, and there's a potential arbitrage in value. So maybe if all the consultants, everyone are looking for something else to do, like satellite is the next place to go. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Charla.
Great, thank you. So I'm a discussant, and I am going to reserve the privilege to not only talk about things that this panel has talked about, but to also raise, but I think actually, Paul, you managed to actually pull up, I think, everything in your comments that I was going to comment on anyway. First, I want to thank you for including me, not only on this panel, but also with all the, the auction theorists and economists that I've over the years have been lucky enough to work with and had a lot of fun with them. One thing I do want to say too is I was very happy that Stuart didn't decide to disinvite me once he realized that Verizon had not bid in the auction. So I'm going to be talking about this from a couple of different points of view. One is to sort of riff a little bit on something that Paul just said, which is, this idea that one day, $40 billion for AWS-3 auction is a surprise. The next day, $20 billion for the incentive auction. Sorry, Greg, the 600 megahertz auction, which is what we generally do call it, is a surprise. But going back to before there were even auctions, one of the first things I ever learned is the reason you hold an auction is so that you can find out what the spectrum is worth at that point in time. And we were constantly, this goes back a long time, and when I was at the Department of Commerce, we were constantly being asked, how much is the spectrum worth? How much is the spectrum worth? We'd say, well, that's why you hold an auction. It's very important to hold an auction. Right now, there are a lot of private auctions. What we need to do is have public auctions. And that led to, first, SMR auctions, which, by the way, in case anybody in this room doesn't recall, everybody at that point said, how can the FCC do this? This is incredibly complicated. They've never done auctions before, and nobody has ever done an electronic auction, and nobody, and on and on and on. Well, they did a fabulous job then, and I have to say, there was a lot of discussion about whether this could happen or not and how it would happen. But once again, the commission, as everybody has been saying, stepped forward and did a really good job, a fabulous job with this auction as well. One of the things that I'm hearing a lot of people were saying is obviously it took a very long time. I think that is one thing that, for future reference, we do need to think about if we're going to use this tool. We actually have to figure out a way to make it shorter. Also, you may ask, why am I allowed to actually talk about this since I didn't, my company didn't bid? But, frankly, that decision was made. First off, I don't know whether, a lot of you in the room probably remember this, as the applications were due in February. The upfront payment was actually not due for 6 months. We were still going into the process of figuring out, was there an interest? Did we need this? Is this something that we wanted to buy? So up to, including, and even after that application process, we were still engaging with the FCC on process, product, how do you actually make it work? And that back and forth, I have to say, and I suspect that Steve will agree with me on this, is that it was an incredibly good process just in terms of, feeling like, the issues that you had were, people heard you and, would actually, figure out ways to tweak the software or do different things. Because despite what people say, this was all new for us too. Even though we're more experienced, in terms of participating in auctions, we had never participated in an auction like that. So in any event, the sort of the one elephant in the room is why didn't Verizon participate? And I urge you all, Preston, where are you, Preston? Preston actually mentioned Nikki Palmer's one quote. I urge you to look that up and read the whole blog because it says why we didn't participate. And the bottom line was, at this point in time, we didn't need the spectrum. And a couple of people have alluded to what has gone on since 2009, which was, basically, I remember first, is Blair still here? Is first Blair talking about it even before. Before the National Broadband Plan, this is something we're thinking about. That was 2009. We actually launched at the tail end of 2010 our first LTE network. So there was a lot of discussion about what spectrum you needed. There was still a lot of focus on low band spectrum. But over that time, and we've all talked about different pieces of this, but just as a reminder, the act passed in 2012. PCAST came out shortly thereafter with this report saying, we've got a way to get access to a lot of spectrum. We've got this idea of doing a sharing regime. John Leibovitz pushed that forward in 3.5. So that was a component. We, at the time, we were like, do we really want to share? We didn't think that we wanted to, but ultimately we began to realize that the higher frequencies were actually going to be able to offer us more more capacity, and that was evidenced in our purchase of Spectrum Co. It was evidenced in our participation in 3.5. What we've been doing with LTEU, the fact that we spent a fair amount of money in AWS3, and that we also within the last 2 years, it's almost exactly 2 years ago, we actually made a huge push on 5G. And honing in eventually on the millimeter wave, where you can actually get a lot of capacity. Now, there are all sorts of trade-offs you make in these, different pieces, but, every company that participates in an auction makes a decision at a particular point in time what the relative trade-offs are, and our decision was that we actually didn't need to purchase, 600 megahertz spectrum at that point. So, so that said, I still have to say I disagree with Paul that I think, and with several other people who talked about the reserve, I do think that was a solution in search of a problem. I don't think there's been any evidence in any auctions where we or AT&T have tried to foreclose. And in fact, I know there's this whole theory that just our presence in an auction scares away bidders. And that some people even suggested that there was active bidding in this auction because we weren't active but the fact is if you go back and look at the auction that is closest to this in the amount of megahertz, there were significantly more participants in that auction. That was the 66 with 90 megahertz of spectrum. There were 168 qualified bidders, 104 winning bidders. If you go and you look at something that's low band spectrum, there were 214 qualified bidders and 101 winning bidders. In this auction, there were 62 qualified bidders and 50 winning bidders. And I'm just saying, I'm not saying that that's dispositive, but the fact is that it didn't actually, our participation did not seem to lead to people running in, to the exits in other auctions. And again, the Commission has at its disposal other ways to deal with competition policy, as does the Department of Justice. And to make something complicated that, as I listen to the economists, there's some disagreement as to how successful it was, the idea that you can't transfer licenses afterwards. I do know that certain parties wound up with a whole lot more reserve licenses than they intended to buy. And that was what David was talking about earlier. So it just sort of is a head scratcher to me. Why did we need to make a very complicated auction even more complicated for a problem that, as far as I can see, doesn't need to be solved? So I'm trying to think if that was one of the big points I wanted to make. Oh, yeah, and actually, yeah, Evan basically convinces me always, that I'm wrong with whatever my opinion was. Because I actually started out, having been working on these things for a long time, I'm a true believer in flexible use and flexibility. And one of the things that I had actually really thought about was, Tom's still in the back, this idea of overlay auctions. But when I sat down with our technical teams and started to work through what the real issues were, it was hard enough for me to deal with them and explain to them at first that they weren't going to know what the band plan was. And eventually, thank you to the FCC, you figured out a way for us to know the band plan in advance and then, be able to bid knowing fairly well what the band plan was. That's a critical piece of how we operate our business. So once again, Evan was right. He and I had constant arguments about this before, long time ago. And I'm sorry he's not here for me to admit publicly that I know he's right. But I've told him privately. So anyway, that's what I have to say, and I'm sure you'll disagree with some of what I have to say. So. And it's only because alphabetically that he gets to speak after I do. So
I did allow a little bit of the tyranny of the alphabet.
Yeah. Good, thanks, and thanks for including me. I do want to start with thanking the FCC staff. It was an incredible process and an incredibly difficult task. And when we started off with this and had the same experience, I think, as Charla, when we started digging into the problems, it seemed pretty insurmountable when you looked at all the pieces that had to come together, from not knowing how much spectrum was there, not knowing how the band plan would be put together, not knowing how the forward and reverse auctions would fit together. It was pretty daunting and lots of details in there. The staff was incredible to work with. A lot of meetings. We had a lot of time and analysis and experts looking at these things, and we would go in with ideas to the FCC. Always an open door, always a good dialogue. Greg would have liked to have more dialogue back and forth with all the economists, but Gary, thankfully, usually just said, that's enough. Really a fantastic job, and, kudos to everybody. And now we just need to stay focused on clearing. The job's not done. But, the auction was very important for T-Mobile. I think Charla is absolutely right that any of these auctions are a snapshot in time for a carrier, and there's lots of decisions that go into whether or not you participate. We took a lot of grief during the proceeding that we hadn't participated in the 700 megahertz auction. But when you look at the facts around that, we had just come out of the AWS-1 auction where we had spent more than, we were the kind of top bidder in that auction, had spent a lot of money, and coming into the 700 megahertz auction that was shortly on the heels of that, it wasn't a place where we could go. We were still digesting the AWS-1 spectrum, had to clear it and deploy it. We certainly would have liked to have had that spectrum earlier. There was also a lot of discussion in the proceeding about the importance of low band for competition. We had AT&T and Verizon with a vast majority of low band spectrum with a clear coverage advantage over us. And it is a huge difference covering area and expanding into rural markets with mid-band spectrum versus low-band spectrum. And frankly, we got our first taste of that, which we always knew it would be important. we got a first taste of it when thankfully
Bought
Verizon
from us.
sold us
Yeah.
their 700 megahertz spectrum that they didn't want. And our engineers found it was actually a much bigger difference than they anticipated in our ability to cover, provide services, to reduce churn, and keep and attract customers. So it made us a far stronger competitor in the market. And we don't have a nationwide 700 megahertz footprint. We have under 200,000 pops, I think, for that. But this auction always remained an important thing for us. And now, as Sean said, we got 31 megahertz nationwide, 25 megahertz average in the top 40 markets, and 40 or so in below that. And we are starting to. We've got plans to roll that out. We've got a lot of work in place. Standards are just being finalized. We've got commitments from manufacturers to have equipment for this year, and as important moving forward, the repacking is. There's actually about 1 million square miles where we can begin deploying now this year, and we will do that, and we'll have handsets by the end of the year. So, and it'll start to fill in those areas where we don't have 700 megahertz low band spectrum. So again, incredibly important, and we're working well with the broadcast community. We've got a big outreach effort to work directly with broadcasters to help make sure that that they've got resources that they need to move. We've invested in the tower community, the antenna community, and have done that over the past year or more to build up that and make sure that that the repacking is feasible in or less than the amount of time that that the FCC has set aside. So we think it's a good program. We're seeing a lot of cooperation. I also want to comment on some of the folks that said that this actually damaged the broadcast industry or didn't do anything for the broadcast industry. I disagree with that. It was a voluntary process. Broadcasters sold their spectrum voluntarily. It's compared to other times when we've gotten broadcast spectrum and have just gone in and moved them non-voluntarily. Yes, broadcasters do have to repack and change channels that didn't sell in the auction or didn't get selected to sell in the auction. But I think overall it's not a harm to the industry. And in fact, we see a lot of, especially from entities like PBS, who got about $1.75 billion out of this auction. And if you look at their releases around, there are groups of PBS stations around the country that have now been able to set up funds that will keep their stations going into the future more independently than they've been able to do that now. So, and we're in a lot of discussions with PBS about their experience and what they need to do to repack, and they are very happy with the results of it. I'll just touch on the reserve, and that was actually a critical part of this auction from our point of view. Charla can say that there was no evidence, but there was plenty of evidence that we put in the record that the risk of foreclosure was real and that there was a real potential for that. And the fact that it didn't happen doesn't mean that there wasn't a real risk. And I think when you look at the complexity added to the auction, it's fairly minimal compared to the benefit of helping ensure that that one of the major goals of the competition, of promoting competition, of the auction, promoting competition, was realized. And it certainly makes us a much stronger competitor there. I'll touch. What auction rule would we have done differently? Probably the $1.25 per megahertz pop trigger that was kind of thrown in, I think, for political reasons to make sure that the auction went for a certain amount. But it was an unnecessary complication from an auction perspective, and thankfully we were able to kind of meet it at the end of the day. But I think, from our perspective, keeping it as simple as possible, as long as you clear the threshold of paying for all the relocation costs, any of the costs associated with the auction, that should have been it. I'll probably leave it at that. I mean, I think that I was not part of the bidding team for T-Mobile. We had an auction team and war room out in Bellevue, or Bellevue headquarters. Certainly from their perspective, they would have liked it to have been shorter, because none of those guys took vacation for a year while they were locked in this war room, which was a pretty impressive place with security sweeps for bugs, and those guys were really, like, it was a guarded facility. Well, the most impressive part of it was that there was a table probably as long as this that was just filled with candy and junk food. I don't know how those guys don't weigh 400 pounds. So, but thank you.
All right, thanks. Dorothy.
I'm delighted to be here. I am not an auction expert, and I only dabble in spectrum policy. I think I'm here because having dabbled in spectrum policy, I went off in the Obama administration to the Defense Department and later GSA, and was the senior real property officer. That wasn't my title, but functionally that's what I did. And so when I got out, I wrote a Brookings paper about lessons from federal property management for federal spectrum management. And I think Stuart is hoping that I can offer up some other areas, some other federal asset disposal scenarios where a reverse auction or a two-sided auction or a reallocative auction might work. And I am going to do that, but I want to also make some other comments, some related comments about freeing up federal spectrum, which are not based directly on use of a two-sided auction. It might be done that way, but it might be done another way through an overlay. I mean, to me, this is pretty obvious, but the big lesson to me of this auction is the broadcasters got to keep the proceeds. Now that's just a no-brainer to you guys, but if you're thinking about federal spectrum, that is not the way it works. So federal agencies don't get to keep the proceeds when federal spectrum is freed up in an auction. And I have argued, and it was one of the main arguments I made in my Brookings paper, that it would be helpful to give federal agencies the right to keep some share of the proceeds. And I drew on analogies in the federal real property area, the base closure process, enhanced use leases, a number of areas where I believe federal agencies are motivated because they get to keep some share of the proceeds. Now, I have Blair's here, and Tom Hazlett, I think both have disagreed with me. And their argument, which makes sense theoretically, is that the appropriators will figure out what's happening and they will take it out of the next year's budget, and smart federal bureaucrats, realizing what's going on, will cease to be motivated by that. And I think that's right in theory, but I'm here to tell you in practice, I don't think it works that way, and I think that's because the budget process is a lot stickier than that theory would imply. And so I think it does make a difference. And I will give you a recent example. This involves the Spectrum Relocation Fund, but the FAA is currently leading an initiative called Sensor. Spectrum Efficient something radar. I've forgotten now what it stands for. It's a 4-agency effort. The other agencies are DoD, Homeland Security, and NOAA. It is an effort to consolidate their radar requirements in another band. I believe the band they'll vacate is 1300 to 1350. I may not have that quite right. It's 50 megahertz. It's a complicated effort. The goal is to auction off 30 megahertz by 2024. So it's not all that much, and it's really far out. I think it is the FCC that is saying you need 20 megahertz of guard band to protect other things that are there. So I think the FAA would be happy to see all 50 auctioned off, but the current plan is 30. The FAA is unbelievably excited about this. I haven't talked to folks in DoD or the other agencies, but they are. I watched a panel, and I was emailing Coleman throughout it, saying, "I only wish Blair Levin could be here to hear this," because these guys were saying, "This is the most exciting initiative I have been part of. This is gonna, I'm retiring soon. This will be my swan song. This is. I mean, they are really psyched about the opportunity to upgrade their radar capability by with the money that they're using out of the Spectrum Relocation Fund. So I think I think Spectrum Relocation Fund helps, but we need to go farther than that. And there's a complicated issue about whether or not they can acquire that radar as a service as opposed to owning and operating the equipment. And it seems they perceive they can't use the Spectrum Relocation Fund money if they are going to acquire it as a service. In the case of the FAA, you want them as much as possible to be acquiring things as a service as opposed to owning and operating. So that's something that needs to be corrected. Second, I think you may see a big change in the FAA world, which there is an effort. This is another one of these decades-long causes that economists have argued for, and that is to spin off the air traffic control system out of the FAA, leaving the FAA as a purely regulatory agency. I have strongly supported that. We tried to do that in the Clinton administration. We were blocked. There is now a very serious effort to do that. Is in the president's skinny budget. There is a biggest champion since Al Gore in the form of House Transportation Chairman Bill Schuster. So I think you may see that happen. This will mark the first time, if it happens, and if it is spun off to a Canadian-style private nonprofit stakeholder-run organization, where you have a large chunk of federal spectrum moving into an organization that is private. There is currently no plan. The private entity cannot buy the spectrum. They use too much of it. It's too valuable. What other countries have done is simply, loan the spectrum indefinitely to the privatized entity. I think that creates absolutely no incentive for more efficient use. And so I think there is an opportunity to think about how do you do that better by letting them keep a share of it, a spectrum fee. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think that's a big deal. And it may create a privatized entity it will have opportunities to go to the capital markets and borrow money and upgrade equipment. So, okay. Just quickly on DoD, I think it's going to be harder to get DoD to relinquish spectrum because I don't think this White House is as motivated as the last one was. I think you need to think of DoD as an engine of technological innovation rather than a spectrum hoarder. At the end of the day, their contribution will be figuring out how to use spectrum that nobody else has figured out how to use. So I think they're a great partner, but I think of them as an engine of innovation as opposed to this recalcitrant spectrum hoarder. Quickly, I think where the two-sided auction I think there are a lot of opportunities in the aviation area. Charla was involved in a big effort that the Bush administration made to auction off slots in the Northeast at LaGuardia, JFK. I don't think it was a two-sided. Well, but it was a reallocated auction. It was an effort to get slots into the hands of some smaller airlines, some upstart airlines. It was a really interesting story. It was blocked very late in the game by the courts, and then the Bush administration ended, and the economy melted down, and so nothing happened. And Carla and I were talking this morning. Her feeling is, most airports are now dominated by one airline, and so maybe there are not the same sorts of pressures. Certainly you don't have the delays that you had then, although they will come back. But I think the nature of the use of the airspace is that bad weather comes and goes, and so when a airport becomes congested, the FAA imposes a ground delay program at departure points. And it's all generally fairly rule-based. But what they do, they shrink the number of arrival spots. They impose that reduced allocation at the departure points, and then there are there's some very limited opportunities for trade, or at least when I looked at this 10 years ago. And it's by and large, there's bartering. It's not a market-based system, but that is a very analogous kind of a situation where you need to reallocate. Now, it needs to be done, I think, pretty much in real time, but that the nature of the airspace where the capacity shrinks when you have bad weather, I think there are a lot of opportunities, and I think if the air traffic control system is shifted to outside of the FAA, you will see that together with technology. You will see a need for much more sophisticated and possibly real-time allocation of scarce airspace and runway space.
Excellent. All right, David, you're batting cleanup.
All right. Well, obviously, a lot of the folks here are much bigger experts in terms of how the auction was conducted and how it was designed. I can provide a little bit of insight from a Hill perspective. Just as by way of background, I was a staffer on the Commerce Committee, and back when the initial 2012 legislation was drafted, and I had a hand throughout that entire process. And what I can say is that certainly Chairman Thune, my boss now, believes that the auction was a success. Lots of money raised for the Treasury, a lot of spectrum opened up for the next generation wireless uses that is a clear priority for him. But going back to 2011, if you had told us that the auction would generate $19 billion in revenue, create money back for the Treasury, release 70 megahertz for licensed and 14 megahertz for unlicensed, that pretty much nailed it right on the head of expectations. As someone who the Senate moved first in the drafting process, and members, staff, stakeholders would ask, what do you think realistically could happen? What would be success? Some people would say 40, some people said 60. And I thought 60 would be successful, 80 would be pretty darn good. Anything above that would be pretty miraculous. Well, 70 landed pretty well, and having an extra 14 for license is pretty solid. And then when you look at the overall revenues, do the overall revenues in the incentive auction come in a little bit lower than people's expectations? Sure. But at the end of the day, the legislation that we passed, which was a holistic bill that not only included the incentive auction, included the auction of other bands, as well as AWS-3, or at least a portion of it, and of course funded FirstNet, which was a huge priority. That bill brought in way more than anyone expected, in large part because AWS-3. But at the end of the day, the legislation was an overall package. And so if you told Congress, hey, we're going to have the FCC design the most complicated auction in the history of humanity, which, by the way, none of us can explain how it's actually going to work. What's an incentive auction? Well, there's a forward auction and a reverse auction. What's a reverse auction? I don't really know. How do they go together? No one knows. They'll figure it out in a few years. But let's just create this and assume it's going to work. And by the way, it's going to actually raise some $60-odd billion worth of revenue and however many back to the Treasury. I don't know the final accounting. That's pretty wonderful. One of the challenges, though, that after we passed that law was indeed the realizing how long it takes for spectrum to get to market. One of the things that we heard at that time was it takes 7 to 13 years from the time that people start really talking about a band to the time it actually gets into the marketplace. Well, looking at AWS-3 and the 600 megahertz auction, that's pretty much exactly where we are. Incentive auctions came up with the National Broadband Plan around 2009. That spectrum won't be into the marketplace until, 1910 or 20? So that's
this year.
10, 11 years. This year.
Deploying this
Well, you're
year.
going to have
We're
some this year?
deploying.
Okay, well, great. So in that case, 8 to 11 years before the spectrum is hopefully lit up. AWS-3, you can argue when that process started, but again, 7 years seems at least as a reasonable minimum, probably more than that because of the clearing time. So one of the things that we tried to work on in the intervening years is trying to shorten that process, at least from the policymaking side. As everyone knows, spectrum auctions tend to have been freed up on an ad hoc basis. People in this room focus on one band, all the political attention goes there, Congress gets engaged, the FCC focuses on it, the administration, if necessary, focuses on it. It takes years and years and years for people to haggle back and forth and figure out, and every single effort is unique to itself. There are no recurring mechanisms for, on the policy side of things, to streamline this, to make regular, to prioritize it. And we worked, and my boss and I came up with, along with Ranking Member Nelson, the Mobile Now Act, which doesn't really address this issue, because we tried, and it's actually really, really hard, as it turns out, to streamline policy. But that's certainly one of the areas where, we have a new tool, the incentive auction. It's proven to be successful. It's, again, complex, and there's no guarantee the next time it will work quite as well, but hopefully it will, based on the lessons that everyone's learned, and conferences like this will help elucidate that. But we do need to figure out how best to deploy that. But again, there's a perhaps even more difficult problem to solve, which is how do we get the policy-making process, the political side of things, to reduce that time? Because on our end, on the political, legislative, and then eventually some of the more political parts of the FCC process, that can take 1 year, but more likely 2 or 3, up to 4 or 5, sometimes even longer than that. That is something that's a long time. I mean, that's even long for legislation. And we come up with a pretty big bill and get it done in a few years, sometimes a few months. The fact that spectrum always takes a few years at a minimum, it seems strange. Obamacare was written in a year and a half. That's a huge deal. Infrastructure may get done in this Congress. That'll be, if it does, and hopefully it will, that'll be, again, within a 2-year cycle. But spectrum often takes multiple Congresses to get done. So that would encourage everyone to focus on that. To comment something on Dorothy said, in terms of the incentives for agencies to participate in some of the auction revenues, much like the broadcasters in the incentive auction, it's an attractive idea. It's one that me and my various bosses and their colleagues have tried to pursue. And while in the FAA's instance, this may be a case where the agency seems to be excited, I can say that we have, particularly with DoD, run into multiple instances where they simply say, A, we don't care about the money, which may or may not be true. But they also said, even if we did do that, we are worried because we've got a pretty good relationship with our appropriators, and we like that process. So that said, a lot of those conversations I've had on that respect happened before the most recent Spectrum Pipeline Act, which did change how the Spectrum Location Fund can be used. And to your point, that is exactly what the FAA is using now, those liberalized rules around the SRF, to do additional research. So it is possible that maybe the Spectrum Pipeline Act from 2015 is maybe helping to crack the code of using these sort of incentives to get more modern technologies into the hands of government users in exchange for being more efficient and hopefully opening up more bands of spectrum. At the end of the day, everyone needs more spectrum. The usage for it is going to increase, both private sector as well as the public sector. And it's going to be all bands. And that's a lesson that, having worked on the Hill on these issues for over a decade, people come in and say, this is the beachfront property. It's the most important thing. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Mid-band, high-band, low-band, it's all good. This is trash spectrum. This is the best. This is everything below 1 gigahertz will always be the most important. Spectrum needs change, as the commentators on this panel, I'm sure, earlier discussed. Spectrum matters to individual players in certain ways at that individual point in time based on the circumstances around the marketplace and technology. Those change. What doesn't change, however, is that spectrum needs are going to increase, and we need to get more of it, of every flavor, and frankly, of every type of allocation, whether it's licensed or unlicensed, shared or exclusive. We need more of all of it. And focusing on individual bands as being the end-all, be-all, focusing on auction revenue, it is a way, and it has been the most successful way at freeing up spectrum, at least from a congressional standpoint, but it's also one that is teaching policymakers perhaps the wrong lessons, that the value is this one band, or the value is in the dollars raised for the Treasury, as opposed to these are the economic drivers of the digital economy that, for all the amazing computing power we're having, when you combine that with mobility, we combine that with not needing wires for whatever technology, whether it's broadband or ATS 3.0, whatever the technology is, that's what's going to drive so much innovation and growth, and that's what policymakers ought to focus on the most.
All right, so in our last 12 minutes or 13 minutes, in particular, if there's any big picture question or point that has not been raised, this is that last opportunity. If there's anything that you feel like, boy, I really wish somebody would talk about this thing about lessons learned, or this was a surprise, or this is how we can use it in the future. Let me in particular suggest that this is the time for anybody, panelists, attendees, et cetera, that hasn't come out, or hasn't come out enough. And I'm willing to call on people. John Leibovitz is looking very pensive. John?
Or maybe just tired. It's often hard to tell. That's,
Wait, sorry. Can you? Too young. He's right there. Sorry, this is John Leibovitz.
I mean, I think we've heard a mostly consensus that the, everyone would like to have had their own little piece of the auction, their own little widget or feature work differently, but generally it was successful. And I agree with what Blair, whoever it was that said that the main point, which is that, this is about government innovation and, government working with the with private markets to help create efficiency. I guess the only thing I would add, which is not about the content, is just that I think we've heard a lot about a lot of people that have been involved in this process, and one thing that Blair, if he was here still, would say is that policy is like a relay race. And we heard about the 4 chair people. There were multiple generations of Hill staff, FCC staff that worked on this, and I think what happens in this type of project is that the people who are sort of there at the end tend to get named and have their pictures on the screens, but there were a lot of people, who worked on the broadband plan, for example, in 2009, who really fleshed out the first iteration of this idea, and that was critical to getting the legislation passed. Even before, Gary became involved, and of course that wasn't probably one of the most successful things that happened, but there was just a lot that happened early on, and I don't see many of those people here now, but hopefully they're somewhere watching and feeling happy that they participated along the way.
Other, so I Preston and I can't see. Let's go with Henning first. We haven't heard from Henning and then Preston. How about that? And do identify yourself.
Henning Schultzoni. Just a kind of a speculative question. Given how much TV spectrum is still left, so to say, in the 600 megahertz, and given how much video consumption is changing, just in terms of, you look at lots of people talk about their kids, but I suspect you all recognize that they consume content, as they call it these days, as opposed to entertainment or whatever, very differently than my generation or even middle generation did. Do you see another, not just a general incentive auction for some DoD spectrum or whatever, another, quote, TV, which will sound very kind of old-fashioned at the time, TV incentive auction happening within the next 10, 20, or ever? Or will it just remain because of the tie-in to retransmission consent and similar type of artifacts as opposed to technology ones? Or will it just kind of fade away? Or what's your prediction just for the lower 600 megahertz band? I'm curious if anybody wants to speculate on that.
Anybody on this panel, anybody, Preston and I want to speculate on that, but I don't know if any of you all. Well, let's remember, this was something that, at the time, remember, there were some people who said, oh, broadcasters should hold off on this incentive auction, wait for the next one, right? There were certainly some people who said that. Now, I don't know how much that actually affected anybody in the reverse auction, but those kinds of things were being bruited about.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say, we actually have seen some of that too, where broadcasters have felt like if they didn't participate, it would be worth more now, and that's clearly not the case, right? And the talk before about overlay, doing an overlay license and having the kind of industry work it out, we looked at whether we could do something with broadcasters a number of times in different companies I've worked at, and it was a pretty insurmountable task. And the value here to us was the certainty around clear, paired spectrum that we could use and know we could put to really good use. And whether or not there is more opportunity, I mean, it was You know, and I think part of the reason that it ended up at 84 megahertz clearing was it was kind of that core band. You avoid channel 37 problem. I mean, as you look down further, it probably gets more complicated and the propagation actually gets a little bit messier down further. So, I mean, whether or not there'll be another one for the broadcast industry, I don't know. But I think there's value in it for some other bands and some satellite bands that we're looking at that could probably benefit from something like this.
I'd just add that it takes an act of Congress at this point to have another television incentive auction. The 2012 Act specified that it only can be one conducted by the Commission. We also for any auctions that occur past 2022, we'll also need another act of Congress. But given the political challenge it was in 2011 and 2012 to get this auction done the first time. Now that was, again, not knowing what the incentive auction would or how it would be and the concerns that, frankly, it might not be voluntary. The National Broadband Plan hinted that it doesn't have to be voluntary. We've kind of gone past that, but given that the repacking process will happen for the next 3 years, by the time there's another opportunity politically for us to engage on a discussion about whether or not there ought to be a broadcast TV incentive auction, the question will be, will people really want that spectrum that much? Because in 5 years from now, it feels like actually not even 5 years from now, 5 months from now, people are going to be talking more about millimeter wave than they are going to be about 600 megahertz. So maybe there will be one, but who knows if the political landscape or the market needs will even be worthwhile in the future.
Preston, yeah, so yeah.
I have a question that was emailed in from someone watching on the stream, and it's for Charla. This person says, would love
they email you.
Would love to know what their vision of a 5G network really looks like. Are we all just going to get irradiated with a beamformed 28 gigahertz data stream as we stand next to antennas placed every 10 feet throughout the city?
That did not come from me. Yeah, I don't think I can.
It was a question for you.
Yeah, no, I get that. But I'm.
You don't know where to start.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how am I supposed to answer that question?
Describe Verizon's vision of a 5G network.
Do you intend to cook your customers or not?
I will not address that question.
When you stop looking at customers.
Are there any slightly more serious questions? Yes.
So this is actually.
Oh, wait, sorry.
Coleman Bazelon Brattle Group, and this is actually
I was joking.
response to the previous question. The underlying economics of the broadcast television industry and the wireless industry that existed 7 years ago when the discussion about this auction started are as true today as they were then. That the opportunity cost of the spectrum in broadcasting is still very low, and the value, certainly the relative value of the spectrum in wireless is still very high, and that economically it would make sense to transfer more spectrum. I think as this auction showed, the mechanism of getting that done can be very complicated.
Right, in fact, the delta is probably only getting bigger. Ilya?
Actually, so that's related to the high frequency spectrum. I sort of have an outsider's question about that related to the vision, which is, if this is line of sight propagation spectrum, why do we need anybody to own it? Like, think about visible spectrum. If I want to turn on a light bulb, I don't need to pay Verizon to do it, right? So, not yet. Right. So why shouldn't this be unlicensed? Because there is no risk that I will interfere on my neighbors. They just pull down the blinds if it's too much light for them. So why should there be private licenses for this high frequency spectrum?
I mean, you pay a power company when you turn on the light switch, right? There's a
but
network
I'll still
that
pay
provides
the company.
that.
If I want to carry it somewhere further, then there will still be, I don't know, could be Comcast or anybody who will do it. I will still, but then I don't pay for the use of the spectrum inside my room to take advantage of the light. right?
So there's Wi-Fi, I mean, or there's
Right,
unlicensed
so
spectrum
why
that you can
shouldn't it
use.
be like
so
Wi-Fi, basically? The question is, why shouldn't all the spectrum that is only line of sight propagation doesn't interfere beyond my house? Why should there be any private ownership of it? It should be just Wi-Fi.
I think most of the deployment is going to be non-line of sight, right? I mean, I think the big issue with the high frequency spectrum has been that it has been line of sight, which isn't super useful. And so one of the technical things that's changed, again, I'm not an engineer, but you guys tell me if I'm wrong, right, is that people have figured out how to make high frequency spectrum work with non-line of sight using like interference cancellation and stuff. And so I mean, it feels to me there's two separate questions, right? How much spectrum do you want to be licensed versus unlicensed, or shared versus exclusive, versus the kind of like frequency and line of sight and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure they're totally correlated.
Right. No, I think it's correlated to the extent that, if you can avoid interference, then there is no reason to have it privately owned. But if interference, is huge, then obviously my argument wouldn't work. And
Yeah,
I think there's still an interference problem. There's still an interference problem, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, with the practical deployment of it.
All right, so I wanna land this plane on time. So first, a banal note to the presenters, anybody who had slides. I'm going to assume that since you put the slides up, and since this has been webcast, then you're okay with those slides then being housed somewhere on the website for this conference. If that is not the case, please email Carol Apkin. You have her email address, and let her know that you don't want your slides up. I assume that since they're already in webcast, you're okay with having them publicly. Now I just want to say, I think this conference has been great, exactly what I wanted, an interesting, robust conversation. It's my only sadness is that everybody I asked to speak said yes, and some people who I didn't even ask said, "Can I please speak?" So I wasn't able to accommodate more people, because there's a lot of people in this room who have a tremendous amount of involvement and a tremendous understanding of all these issues. And I just want to say, as a point of personal privilege, it's been a lot of work, but it's been a lot of fun for me to put this conference together. I do have to give a shout out to Tsuyao Lin, who is Larry Alcibel's student, and to Carol Apkin, who's been heroic in putting all this. None of this would have happened without them. And with that, I want to thank everybody for a great conference.